Good day, everyone. Today we will be going to discuss first the chapter 5, which is employee selection, references, and testing. So, in this chapter, we discuss several other techniques that are preferred by industrial psychologists to select employees. Now, let us start with predicting performance using references and letters of recommendation. In psychology, a common belief is that the best predictor of future performance is past performance. Thus, if an organization wants to hire a salesperson, the best applicant might be a successful salesperson who held jobs which were similar to the one for which he is now applying. Verifying previous employment is not difficult, but it can be difficult to verify the quality of previous performance. An employer must obtain information about the quality of previous performance by relying on an applicant's references, either by calling those references directly or asking for letters of recommendation from previous employers. But before discussing this topic further, it might be a good idea to differentiate among reference checks, references, and letters of recommendation. A reference check is the process of confirming the accuracy of information provided by an applicant. It helps potential employers confirm that candidates have been honest in their job application and interview responses. Now, there are some questions employers ask when conducting a reference check, like when did the name of the applicant work for your company? Could you confirm starting and ending employment dates? When did she leave the company? And what was her position? Can you describe the job responsibilities that um, were those are some examples of questions when conducting a reference check. Now, a reference is the expression of an opinion, either orally or through a written checklist, regarding an applicant's ability, previous performance, work habits, character, or potential for future success. The content and format of a reference are determined by the person or organization asking for the reference. And lastly, a letter of recommendation is a letter expressing an opinion regarding an applicant's ability, previous performance, work habits, character, or potential for future success. The content and format of a letter of recommendation are determined by the letter writer. Now I will discuss about the reasons for using references and recommendation. First is confirming details on a resume. As mentioned in chapter 4, it is not uncommon for applicants to engage in resume fraud or lying on their resumes about what experience or education they actually have. Thus, one reason to check references or ask for letters of recommendation is simply to confirm the truthfulness of information provided by the applicant. An excellent example of resume fraud is the bizarre 1994 assault against figure skater Nancy Kerrigan, arranged by Sean Eckhart, the bodyguard of Kerrigan's skating rival Tony Harding. Harding hired Eckhart as her bodyguard because his resume indicated he was an expert in counterintelligence and international terrorism, had graduated from an elite executive protection school, and had spent 4 years tracking terrorist cells and conducting a successful hostage retrieval operation. After the attack against Kerrigan, however, a private investigator discovered that Eckhart never graduated from a secured school and would have been 16 during the time he claimed he was in Europe, saving the world from terrorists. The president of a school he did attend stated that he wouldn't hire Eckhart as a bodyguard in a lifetime, an opinion that would have been discovered had Harding checked Eckhart's references. But resume fraud may not initially seem like a great problem, but also consider this other example. In 2007, Marilee Jones, the dean of admission at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, resigned after admitting that she had lied about having college degrees from three different universities. Now, the second is checking for discipline problems. A second reason to check references or obtain letters of recommendation is to determine whether the applicant has a history of such discipline problems as poor attendance, sexual harassment, and violence. Such a history is important for an organization to discover to avoid future problems as well as to protect itself from a potential charge of negligent hiring. If an organization hires an applicant without checking his references and background, and he later commits a crime while in the employ of the organization may be found liable for negligent hiring if the employee has a criminal background that would have been detected had a background check been conducted. Negligent hiring cases are typically filed in court as common law cases or torts. These cases are based on the premise that an employer has the duty to protect its employees and customers from harm caused by its employees or products. In determining negligent hiring, courts look at the nature of the job. Organizations involved with the safety of the public, such as police departments and daycare centers, must conduct more thorough background and reference checks than organizations like retail stores. Such checks are important as demonstrated by a study done by a reference checking firm which found that 12.6% of applicants had undisclosed criminal backgrounds. Now, this is an example of a negligent hiring. A, a child care center in California hired an employee without checking his references. A few months later, the employee molested a child at the center. The employee had a criminal record of child abuse that would have been discovered with a simple call to his previous employer. As one would expect, the court found the employer guilty of negligent hiring because the employer had not taken reasonable care in ensuring the well being of its customers. Another example, in Virginia, an employee of a grocery store copied the address of a female customer from a check she had written to the store. The employee later went to the customer's home and raped her. In this example, a case for negligent hiring could not be made because the company had contacted the employee's previous employment references and had found no reason not to hire him. Because there was nothing to discover and because the store had taken reasonable care to check its employees, it was not guilty of negligent hiring. Third is discovering new information about the applicant. Employers use a variety of methods to understand the personality and skills of job applicants. References and letters of recommendation certainly can be two of these methods. Former employers and professors can provide information about an applicant's work habits, character, personality, and skills. Care must be taken, however, when using these methods because the opinion provided by any particular reference would be inaccurate or purposefully untrue. The fourth is predicting future performance. As what I have said, in psychology, a common belief is that the best predictor of future performance is past performance. References and letters of recommendation are ways to try to predict future performance by looking at past performance. Even though references are commonly used to screen and select employees, they have not been successful in predicting future employee success. In fact, a meta analysis found that the average uncorrected validity coefficient for references or letters of recommendation and performance is only 0.18 with a corrected validity of 0.29. This low validity is largely due to four main problems with references and letters of recommendation: leniency, knowledge of the applicant, low reliability, and extraneous factors involved in writing and reading such letters. Now, first is the leniency. Research is clear that most letters of recommendation are positive. Fewer than 1% of references rate applicants as below average or poor. Because we have all worked with terrible employees at some point in our lives, it would at first seem surprising that references typically are so positive, but keep in mind that applicants choose their own references. On the other hand, because an employer can be guilty of negligent hiring for not contacting references, a former employer also can be guilty of negligent reference if it does not provide relevant information to an organization that requests it. For example, if Dinero Bank fires John Smith for theft and fails to divulge that fact to a bank that is thinking of hiring John Smith, Dinero Bank may be found liable if Smith steals money at his new bank. Next is the knowledge of the applicant. A second problem with letters of recommendation is the person writing the letter often does not know the applicant well, has not observed all aspects of an applicant's behavior, or both. Professors are often asked to provide recommendations for students whom they know only for one or two classes. Such recommendations are not likely to be as accurate and complete as those provided by professors who have had students in several classes and perhaps worked with them outside the classroom setting. Even in a work setting in which a supervisor provides the recommendation, he often does not see all aspects of an employee's behavior. Employees often act very differently around their supervisors than they do around coworkers and customers. Next is reliability. The third problem with references and letters of recommendation involves the lack of agreement between two people who provide references for the same person. Research reveals that reference reliability is only 0.22. the problem with reliability is so severe that there is more agreement between recommendations written by the same person for two different applicants than between two people writing recommendations. Thus, letters of recommendation may say more about the person writing the letter than about the person for whom it is being written. Next is the extraneous factors. The fourth problem with letters of recommendation concerns extraneous factors that affect the writing and evaluation. Research has indicated that the method used by the letter writer is often more important than the actual content. For example, researchers found that letters that contained specific examples were rated higher than letters that contained generalities. Merapian and Waynes found that even though most letters of recommendation are positive, letters written by references who like applicants are longer than those written by references who do not. This is important because Loher and colleagues found that the longer the recommendation letter, the more positively the letter was perceived. Because providing references and letters of recommendation is a rather subjective process, several ethical problems can arise involving their use. Now, these are the three ethical guidelines that reference providers should follow. First, explicitly state your relationship with the person you are recommending. That is, are you the applicant's professor, boss, coworker, friend, relative, or some combination of the five? This is important because people often have dual roles. A person may be a supervisor as well as a good friend. Without understanding the exact nature of the referee referent relationship, making judgments about the content of a reference can be difficult. For example, I was told of a situation in which an applicant received a glowing letter of recommendation from a coworker and in which the applicant was hired in part due to the strength of that letter. But within a few months, the new employee was engaged in discipline problems, and it was only then that the organization discovered that the person who had written the glowing letter was the applicant's daughter. Because the mother's and daughter's last names were different, and because the exact relationship between the two was not stated in the letter, the organization never suspected that they were related. Second, be honest in providing details. A referee has both an ethical and a legal obligation to provide relevant information about an applicant. A good rule of thumb is to ask, if I were in the reference seeker's shoes, what would I need to know? Of course, deciding what information to provide can often be a difficult process. Finally, let the applicant see your reference before sending it and give him the chance to decline to use it. Such a procedure is fair to the applicant and reduces the referee's liability for any defamation charge. Though this last piece of advice seems wise, it can result in some uncomfortable discussion about the content of references that are not positive. The next topic is predicting performance using applicant training and education. For many jobs, it is common that applicants must have a minimum level of education or training to be considered. That is, an organization might require that managerial applicants have a bachelor's degree to pass the initial applicant screening process. Though degree requirements may seem logical, the research literature has found inconsistent results regarding their validity. A meta-analysis by Hunter and Hunter 1984 found that the validity of education was only zero point 0.10 and that it did not add any predictive power over the use of cognitive ability test. However, a meta-analysis of the relationship between education and police performance found that education was a valid predictor of performance in the police academy and performance on the job. And also, meta-analysis indicate that a student's GPA can predict job performance, training performance, promotions, salary, and graduate school performance. GPA is most predictive in the first few years after graduation. As with many measures of cognitive ability, the use of GPA will result in high levels of adverse impact. Next topic is predicting performance using applicant knowledge. It is used primarily in the public sector, especially for promotions. Job knowledge tests are designed to measure how much a person knows about a job. For example, applicants for a bartender position might be asked how to make a martini or a white Russian, and applicants for an HR position might be asked how to conduct a job analysis. These tests are similar to the exams given several times a semester in a college class. They are typically given in multiple choice fashion for ease of scoring, but they also can be written in essay format or given orally in a job interview. Common examples of job knowledge tests include test of computer programming knowledge, knowledge of electronics, and knowledge of mechanical principles. Standardized job knowledge tests are commonly used by state licensing boards for such occupations as lawyers and psychologists. Job knowledge tests have excellent content and criterion validity, and because of their high face validity, they are positively accepted by applicants. Even though job knowledge tests do a good job of predicting performance, they often result in adverse impact and can be used only for jobs in which applicants are expected to have job knowledge at the time of hire or promotion.
Predicting performance using applicant ability.
Ability tests assess an applicant's ability to learn or perform a job related skill. These tests are most usually utilized in jobs where applicants are not expected to know how to do the jobs at the time of employment, as new workers will instead be taught the relevant job skills and expertise, and these tests are often used because they are very affordable and simple. However, the drawbacks is that there are high levels of adverse, like validity and difficulty in setting a passing score.
Such ability tests test abilities of individuals such as their cognitive ability. This includes oral and written understanding, oral and written expression, numerical facility, originality, memory, reasoning, and general learning are all factors to consider. Since cognitive capacity is required for professional, clerical, and supervisory employment such as supervisor, accountant, and a secretary, as are the ones who have to deal with certain choices. Perceptual ability. It includes an individual's sense of vision, color, and depth perception, glare sensitivity, speech, and hearing, as these dimensions ability are important for jobs like mechanist, cabinet builder, die setter, and tool and die maker, as they mostly use their five senses in their work. Psychomotor ability. It involves finger dexterity, manual dexterity, control precision, and other abilities, multi-limb coordination, response control, reaction time, and arm-hand coordination stability, wrist finger speed, and limb movement speed. As carpenters, police officers, sewing machines, operators, post office clerks, and truck drivers all benefit from psychomotor ability as they depend on their quick thinking and reaction on situations. Physical ability are typically used for professions requiring physical strength and endurance, such as police officers, firemen, and lifeguards. Physical ability is assessed through either job simulations or physical agility, as using a job simulation with candidates display work-related physical habits. Physical ability tests are utilized since simulations are difficult to use to quantify these sorts of actions. Instead of imitating defensive barriers, tests that evaluate fundamental talents required to conduct these behaviors are designed. Tests that are often used to assess the talent required to undertake protective actions. According to research, there are 9 fundamental physical talents, such as dynamic strength, trunk strength, explosive strength, static strength, dynamic flexibility, extent flexibility, gross body equilibrium, gross body coordination, and stamina. The Wonderlic Personal Test is one of the most extensively utilized cognitive ability exams in the industry. The test's popularity stems the fact that it takes up only 12 minutes to complete and that it can be administered in a group setting. The Miller Analogies test, the Quick test, and the Raven progressive matrices are also renowned cognitive assessments to name for a few. Predicting performance using applicant skill. Rather of assessing an applicant's present knowledge or aptitude to execute a job, some selection procedures assess how well an applicant already knows a work-related skill. The work sample and the assessment center are two of the most prevalent approaches for accomplishing this. Work samples are excellent selection tools for several reasons. They are directly related to job tasks, they have excellent content validity, work sample scores tend to predict actual work performance and thus have excellent criterion validity. Job applicants can see the connection between the job sample and the work performed on the job. The samples have excellent face validity and thus are challenged less frequently in civil service appeals or in court. The main reason for not using samples is that they can be expensive to both construct and administer. Assessment centers. Various assessment methods are used in this selection procedure, allowing multiple assessors to really witness applicants do simulated work activities. Its main benefits are that the evaluation methods are all job related and the use of several qualified assessors helps to prevent against various sorts of selection biases. In order to be considered or deemed as an assessment center's activities must be based on a result of thorough job analysis, it must be through simulation, and multiple trained assessors must be used. Furthermore, behavioral observations must be documented at the time the applicant behavior is observed. Assessors must be the ones to report of their observations. An applicant has to be based on the combination of information from the multiple assessors and multiple techniques. An overall evaluation of an applicant cannot be made until all assessment center tasks have been completed. Development and component. The first step in establishing an assessment center is to do a job analysis, with exercises that measure various facets of the work are created. The in-basket technique is designed to stimulate the types of daily information that appear on a manager's or employee's desk. The technique takes its name from the wire basket typically seen in office desks. Simulations such as role plays and work samples can be used to play a candidate in a scenario that is as close as to one that should be experienced on the job feasible. Work samples, leaderless groups discussions, organized interviews, personality and ability assessment, and business games are all common exercises. Each of these strategies can be employed on its own, but they only become part of an assessment center when several are utilized together. Predicting performance using prior experience. Applicant experience is typically measured in one of four ways: experience ratings of application or resume information, biodata, reference checks, and interviews.
Experience ratings. The concept behind experience ratings is that previous experience predicts future experience, as the amount of experience, the degree of performance displayed during past experience, and how relevant the experience is to the current position must be all considered. That is, experience alone is insufficient. A decade of low quality, unconnected experience is not the same as a decade of high quality linked experience.
Biodata. It is a process of selection that takes into account an applicant's life, school, other activities, and community, as well as job experience, as it is an excellent predictor of work performance and the greatest predictor of future employee tenure. This biodata instrument is a blank application or questionnaire including items that research has found distinguishes between successful and unsuccessful work performance. Each question is assigned a weight based on how well it distinguishes between bad and good performances. Several advantages of biodata is that research has shown that they can predict work behavior in many jobs, including sales, management, clerical, mental health counseling, hourly work, in processing plants, grocery clerking, fast food work, and supervising. They have been able to predict criteria as varied as supervisor ratings, absenteeism, accidents, employee theft, loan default, sales, and tenure. Another is that biodata is also an instrument which results in higher organizational profit and growth. And lastly, biodata is an instrument which is easy to use, quickly administered, inexpensive, and not as a subject to individual biases such as interviews, references, and resume evaluation. Development of a biodata instrument. Employee information is gathered in one of two ways, through a file or through a questionnaire. We acquire information on employees' previous employment, education, interests, and demographics from personal files using the file technique. One of the key drawbacks of the file technique is that data is frequently missing or incomplete. While the questionnaire approach involves administering a biographical questionnaire to all employees and candidates, with the downside that information from individuals who have quit or been fired cannot be acquired. Shame!
Hello everyone, let's talk about predicting the performance of employees in terms of personality, interest, and character. Personality inventories are a type of questionnaire that is designed to reveal the respondents' or employees' personality traits. It reveals information about the individual's social traits, motivation, strength, weaknesses, and attitudes. Personality inventories can be categorized as test of normal personality and test of psychopathology. Test of normal personality measures the traits exhibited by normal individual in everyday life. It could measure the traits of a person such as its shyness, its extroversion, assertiveness, and friendliness. An example of this is the five-factor model of personality by McRae and Costa, which measures the extroversion, neuroticism, openness to experience, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. The type of inventory in measuring the normal personality of an individual could be theory-based, empirically based, or statistically based. Theory-based indicates that a test is grounded on a theory by a well-known theorist. Let's take the example of Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. It is a self-report inventory that identifies a person's personality type, strength, and preferences, and the construction of the test is based on Carl Jung's theory of personality type. Statistically based is determined through factor analysis. Factor analysis simplifies the complex structure of human personality into smaller data that is manageable and understandable. For example, the 16 personality factor by Raymond Cattell. Since personality is a wide scope, Cattell formulated fewer number of factors of personality by generating 16 dimensions to easily understand and measure the intended personality. Empirically based is based on an observed and measured phenomena by grouping the answers of people to generate certain characteristics. For example, the Minnesota Multifaceted Personality Inventory were administered to a group of healthy people and to a group of people who have psychological problems to assess the clinical symptoms by testing a pool of items and then selecting the items that discriminate between groups.
The mentioned personality inventories were useful for trainings and development of employees. However, since they are self-reports, they are relatively easy to fake. Tests of psychopathology determine whether individuals have serious psychological problems such as depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and others. The test could be scored objectively or projectively. Projective test uses unstructured tasks, such as drawing pictures, or they will be asked to describe what they saw in 10 ink blots. An example of this is the Rorschach ink blot test. Since projective test has questionable reliability and validity, time consuming, and expensive, the objective tests were frequently used in the organization since it is standardized, such as the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory 2. The test of psychopathology is useful in employment of an employee to assess if a prospective employee can handle the job as well as its demand under stressful and demanding conditions. Interest inventories taps a person's vocational interest or the preference of individuals on certain career choices or activities. This allows job seekers or those seeking a change in career to explore their interests and passion to find a satisfying career. An example of this is the strong interest inventory. It involves questions such as repairing electrical wiring, bargaining, taking responsibility, and many more. It is also useful in vocational counseling where they help people find careers that suits them best. Applicants are measured using the interest inventory, which refers to the careers the individuals are compatible, and the ability test, which are the necessary abilities to enter those careers. The scores of interest inventory and ability test should be high to be fit on a certain career. What's beautiful is that those individuals who have high interest inventory and low in ability test will be advised to go on different types of training to be prepared once they will continue the career. The integrity test, or also known as the honesty test, is designed to assess an applicant's tendency to be honest, trustworthy, and dependable. The test has the probability of telling the employer if the employee will steal money from the organization. Integrity test of an applicant could be measured through overt and personality test. Overt integrity test is based on person's attitude and previous theft behavior. This includes asking the test taker to estimate the frequency of theft in a society, how harsh penalties against thieves should be, how easy it is to steal, how often he has personally been tempted to steal, how often his friends have stolen, and how often he has stolen. On the other hand, the personality integrity test measures different personalities of an individual that will tap behaviors such as absenteeism, theft, or even violence. An example is a personal reaction blank. The validity of the integrity test could be measured by comparing the test scores of applicants in their polygraph test results or the lie detector test, the self-admission theft, or the ability of an applicant to tell about his or her criminal history, the shrinkage or shoplifting or employee theft of goods, as well as the known groups and the future theft. And people may steal due to personal tendency or intention to steal, as well as economic pressures such as financial emergencies in the organization, or it could be a reaction to organizational policies such as termination or layoffs.
The conditional reasoning tests are designed to assess an individual's implicit preparedness to engage in behaviors intended to cause harm to others, specifically aggression. An example of this is the conditional reasoning test of aggression by James and McIntyre. It provides test takers with a series of statements and then asks the respondent to select the reason that best justifies or explains each of the statements. For example, if an employee wants to discuss and associate with you during the training program, it could be letter A, the employee wants to share ideas with you, or letter B, the employee was trying to get some ideas from you to use it for his personal gains. If a test taker chooses the letter B, then it suggests a more aggressive tendency since aggressive individuals view people with a harmful intention behind their behavior. Graphology is another way of selecting employees based on handwriting analysis. Graphologist looks at the size, the slant, the width, the regularity, and pressure of a writing sample, and it will reveal information about the temperament and mental, social, work, and moral traits of an applicant. For example, if you write with rounded letters, then this could mean you are creative and artistic. Whereas if you write with pointed letters, then this could mean you are intense and curious. However, graphologists are making their predictions more on the content of the writing than on the quality of the handwriting. What are medical and psychological problems that could limit employee performance? First is drug testing. It is taking a person's blood, urine, saliva, or hair follicles to see if they have taken illegal drugs. These are used in industrial setting since employees who have taken drugs are prone to absenteeism, tiredness or sleeping, or even worse, accidents. The urine sample is taken to EMIT, RI, or the thin layer chromatography. Among the four mentioned ways of detecting drug usage, testing hair follicles is more advantageous since it can detect drug usage over a longer period. However, testing hair follicles could take fewer days before the drug could be detected. Second is the psychological exams. It identifies and describes emotional, behavioral, or learning problems. This exam is useful in industrial setting to determine if an employee is a danger to himself or others and if he or she could function and effectively manage his tasks. Medical exams determine the physical fitness of an applicant for a job. It lets employers know how suitable any given candidate is for a position and how they can accommodate a prospective employee through their time with the company. For example, If an employee has heart problems, then the demands of the work should also be considered. The different selection techniques were compared and analyzed, and it showed that the most valid and better techniques in predicting job performance are the cognitive ability test, a work sample of either verbal or motor skills, and structured interview. While the unstructured interview, interest inventories, and some of the personality inventories do not predict future job performance. Some of the selection techniques may also lead to legal challenge when applicants feel that their privacy is not safe when recruiters ask irrelevant information, especially if it is not job related. Applicants perceive interviews, work samples or simulations, and resumes as job related. The cognitive ability and GPA could have an adverse impact on the applicants since it can be racially or ethnically discriminatory. Applicants who are not hired for a certain job position must be notified and rejected properly by sending rejection letter to help them sustain their interest in future job positions. There are 5 ways in properly rejecting the applicants. First, send a rejection letter or email to the applicant. Second, don't send the rejection letter immediately because they may feel that they are a terrible candidate and that they were not given proper consideration. Send the rejection letter within a 2-week period after the interview. Third, be as personable and as specific as possible in the letter. Rejection letter should be concise and infuse the letter with warmth and human touch by appreciating the applicant for applying and indicate the person who got the job. This will lead us to the next ways by including the individual who received the job. Applicants will have a better view of how the selection process is done and they will be satisfied. Last is do not include the name of the contact person because it could decrease the probability that a person will reapply for future jobs or use the company's product.
Now let's move on to chapter 6, which is evaluating selection techniques and decisions. In this chapter, we will discuss how to evaluate whether a particular selection method is useful and how to use test scores to make hiring decisions. The first topic is the characteristics of effective selection techniques. This technique has 4 characteristics. They are reliable, valid, cost-efficient, and legally defensible. Let's discuss first reliability. Reliability refers to the consistency of a measure. If the item result can be consistently achieved by using the same methods under the same circumstances, the measurement is considered reliable. However, if a score from a measure is not stable or error-free, it is not useful. For example, you measure the temperature of a liquid sample, like blood or urine. You measure that sample several times under identical conditions. The thermometer displays the same temperature every time, so the results are reliable. Another example is that a doctor uses a symptom questionnaire to diagnose a patient with a long-term medical condition. Several different doctors use the same questionnaire with the same patient but give different diagnoses, meaning ang questionnaire na ilahang gigamit has low reliability as a measure of the condition, which means nga ang questionnaire is not really useful. But of course, it is not quite as simple as saying you think a test is reliable. There are several ways in determining if the tests are reliable or not.
Okay, now so let's talk about validity. So validity is the degree to which inferences from scores on test or assessments are justified by the evidence. As with reliability, a test must be valid to be useful. But just because a test is reliable doesn't mean that it is valid. For example, suppose that we want to use height requirements to hire typists. Our measure of a height or using a ruler would certainly be a reliable measure. Most adults will get no taller, and 2 people measuring an applicant's height will probably get very similar measurements. It is doubtful, however, that height is related to their typing performance. Thus, a ruler would be a reliable measure of height, but height would not be a valid measure of typing performance. Even though reliability and validity are not the same, they are related. The potential validity of a test is limited by its reliability. Thus, if a test has poor reliability, it cannot have high validity. Instead, we think of reliability as having a necessary but not sufficient relationship with validity. There are 5 common strategies to investigate the validity of scores on a test. One is criterion, content, construct, phase, and known group. Choosing a way to measure validity. With 3 common ways of measuring validity, one might logically ask which of these methods is the best to use. As with most questions in psychology, the answer is that it depends. In this case, it depends on the situation as well as what the person conducting the validity study is trying to accomplish. If it is to decide whether the test will be a useful predictor of employee performance, then content validity will usually be used, and criterion validity study will also be conducted if there are enough employees and if a good measure of job performance is available. A test itself can never be valid. When we speak of validity, we are speaking about the validity of the test scores as they relate to a particular job. A test may be a valid predictor of tenure for counselors but not of performance for shoe salespeople. Thus, when we say that a test is valid, we mean that it is valid for a particular job and a particular criterion. No test will ever be valid for all jobs and all criteria.
If 2 or more tests have similar validities, then cost should be considered. That is what we mean by cost efficiency. To give you an example, there is this cognitive ability test in selecting police officers, such as the Wonderlic Personal Test or the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Test, or the WISE. Both tests have similar validities and reliabilities. Yet, to figure out which among the two is the best deal, it was found out that it is the Wonderlic Personal Test, as it costs only a few dollars per applicant and can be administered to groups of people in only 12 minutes. Imagine what's less expensive and more efficient. That's how cost efficiency works.
The second topic is establishing the usefulness of a selection device. Even when a test is both reliable and valid, it is not necessarily useful. So imagine an organization that already has a test that does a good job of predicting performance. Even though a new test is considered may be valid, the old test may have worked so well that the current employees are all successful. Or the organization may have such a good training program that current employees are all successful. Thus, a new test, even though it is valid, may not provide any improvement. So, the question here is, how can you demonstrate the value or utility of your new and old employee assessment? So, to determine how useful a test would be in any given situation, several formulas and tables have been designed. These are Taylor-Russell tables, proportion of correct decisions, Loschie tables, and Brogden-Cronbach-Glasser utility formula. So, let's get to know first the Taylor-Russell tables. Taylor-Russell tables is a probability table designed to estimate the expected percentage of successful employees when using a particular assessment tool. But before we use this table, we need the 3 pieces of information. First is the criterion-related validity coefficient. It is simply just a correlation between the scores on the test and job performance. Let's say, for example, you have 100 people take the assessment and you would get a range of scores on that particular test. And let's say you hired all 100 of those people and you follow them over 12 months period, then obtain their performance evaluation scores at the end of the 12 months. Thus, you simply correlate the 2 sets of scores, and that essentially is the validity coefficient. Next piece of information is the selection ratio. It is simply the percentage of people an organization must hire. The ratio is determined by the formula. This is the number of candidates hired divided by the total number of qualified applicants. So if you have 100 people that apply for the software engineer position and you hire 50 of those, then your selection ratio would be 0.5 or 0.50. One thing to remember is that the applicants should be qualified. Pananglitan, na kay 100 applicants and only 20 are qualified. Ang imo rang gamiton kay ang 20 ka-applicants sa denominator and they should be qualified applicants in order to give you more accurate selection ratio. Last piece of information is the performance-based rate. It is the percentage of your current employees that are considered to be above average, or high performers. This figure is usually obtained in one of two ways. The first method is the most simple but the least accurate. Employees are split into two equal groups based on their scores on some criterion such as tenure or performance. The base rate used in this method is always zero point 0.5 or 0.50 because one half of the employees are considered satisfactory. The second and more meaningful method is to choose a criterion measure score above which all employees are considered successful. For example, ang validity coefficient is 0.3 or 0.30, which is the correlation between the scores on the new test and job performance. And in the selection ratio, let's say you have 100 qualified applicants and you only choose 20. So you have a selection ratio of 0.20. And for performance-based rates is 0.5 or 0.50. That's 50% of your current employees who are above average and 50% are below. So in the table, baseline performance is 0.50. Across the top, you'll see the selection ratio of 0.20, not counting the very first column where it says R that refers to the criterion-related validity coefficient. So in using the table, you go first to the criterion validity coefficient, and in our example, ang validity coefficient kay 0.30. Then you move across to the selection ratio, which is 0.20, and the number intersects the two kanang makita ninyo sa arrow nga naggikan sa validity coefficient and selection ratio nagpoint sa 0.67, meaning the 67% of all new hires selected using the new assessment can be expected to be satisfactory performers or above average. Next is the proportion of correct decisions. The only information needed to determine the proportion of correct decisions is employee test scores and the scores on the criterion. The two scores from each employee are graphed on a chart. Take a look at the figure 6.1. Lines are drawn from the point on the y-axis or criterion score that represents a successful applicant, and from the point on the x-axis represents the lowest test score of a hired applicant. As you can see, these lines divide the scores into four quadrants. The points located in quadrant 1 represent employees who scored poorly on the test but performed well on the job. Points located in quadrant 2 represents employees who scored well on the test and were successful on the job. Points in quadrant 3 represents employees who scored high on the test yet did poorly on the job. And points in quadrant 4 represents employees who scored low on the test and did poorly on the job. To estimate the test effectiveness, the number of points in each quadrant is totaled, and the following formula is points in quadrants 2 plus points in quadrants 4 divided by the total points in all quadrants. Another thing is that the resulting number represents the percentage of time that we expect to be accurate in making a selection decision in the future. So, in determining whether this is an improvement, we use the following formula, which is points in quadrant 1 plus points in quadrants 2 divided by the total points in all quadrants. Next is the Lossy tables. It is designed to estimate a given candidate's probability of success given his or her score on a chosen assessment. Example, you administer test A to a candidate, and depending on where that certain candidate scores on that test, you'll be able to use this table to predict how likely that candidate will be successful in the new role. To use these tables, there are three pieces of information. Just like Taylor-Russell tables, the first piece of information is the criterion-related validity coefficient, which is the correlation between the scores on the test and job performance. Next is the performance-based rate. It is the percentage of your current employees that are considered to be above average or high performers. Lastly is the candidate scores on the new assessment. Candidate scores should be divided into 5 levels, such as top 20%, next 20%, and so on. In the following slide, you can see the Lossy tables and the 5 segments or levels. So let's go back to the example of Taylor-Russell tables, wherein the validity coefficient is 0.30, the performance base rate is 0.50, and for the third, let's say there are 10 candidates, and that Novella Vin, a hypothetical candidate, scored third highest, putting her in the second 20% band. Now with these three pieces of information, let's go to the Lossy tables. The performance baseline is 50%, validity coefficient is 0.30, and Novelle-Levin scored in the second 20% rather, and you can see in the table there are three red circles, and the intersection you see there says 57, and this indicates that probability that the candidate with a particular score will be a successful employee. So if we interpret it, given Novelle-Levin's test scores on the new test, her probability of success on the job is 57%. In other words, if you were to use the new assessment to make a hiring decision for Novelle, her likelihood of succeeding the job is slightly above 50%. Lastly is the Brogdon-Cronbach lesser utility formula. It enables you to estimate the amount of money your organization would save if you were to use the new test or assessment to make hiring decisions. To use this formula, 5 items of information must be known. First, number of employees hired per year. It is simply the number of employees who are hired for a given position in a year. Next is the average tenure. It's the average length of time that employees in a given position stay with your company in years. Test validity is the correlation between the scores on the new assessment and job performance. The fourth is we're going to be using what's called a 40% rule that was proposed by Hunter and Schmidt back in 1982. And this says that a high-performing employee is estimated to be about one standard deviation in terms of performance from an average employee in value, amounting to about 40% in salary difference. Last is the mean standardized predictor score of selected applicants. This number is obtained in one of two ways. The first method is to obtain the average score on the selection test for both the applicants who are hired and the applicants who are not hired. The second way to find mean standard deviation is to compute the proportion of applicants who are hired and then use a conversion table to convert the proportion into a standard score. Let us have an example using this formula. So a growing software startup hired 52 Java programmers in 2020. And for that role, the average length of time or tenure is 2.2 years. We have 3.0 for the test validity, and using the 40% rule, let's assume that each of these Java programmers make 100,000 a year. So we're going to take 40,000 as our standard deviation. Let's just say the average score of 15 hired applicants from the 52 applicants is 82.5, and for the rest or 37 rejected applicants is 68.2, and the standard deviation of all scores is 16.8. So the mean standardized test score is 0.85. Also, to determine the savings of the company, we use the following formula, which is the savings equals the number of employees hired per year, the tenure, the test validity, the standard deviation, and mean. I-multiply na siya tanan. Then minus cost of testing. So to get the cost of testing, you will multiply the number of applicants and the number of cost per applicant. Let's just assume that the number of cost per applicant is $20. So 52 times $20 is $1,040. So let us now compute. 52 times 2.2 times 0.30 times $40,000 times 0.85, then minus $1,040, and roughly this is the savings of your company, which is $1,165,820. This means that by using the new assessment to make hiring decisions for a 2.2 year rather, your company will roughly save $1.2 million.
Next, we need to determine the fairness of a test. Once a test has been determined to be reliable and valid and to have utility for an organization, the next step is to ensure that the test is fair and unbiased. The term biased or unbiased refers to the technical aspects of a test. A test is considered biased if there are two group differences. For example, their sex, race, or age in test scores that are unrelated to the construct that is being measured. For example, if race differences on a test of logic are due to vocabulary words found more often in white Americans than African Americans' culture, the test might be considered biased. The term fairness can also include bias, but also includes political and social issues. Typically, a test is considered fair if people of equal probability of success on a job have an equal chance of being hired. Though some people argue that the test is unfair if members of a protected class score lower than the majority, like example, white people or men. The first step in determining a test's potential bias is finding out whether it will result in adverse impact. There are two basic ways to determine this. First, looking at test results or anticipating adverse impact prior to the test. Adverse impact occurs if the selection rate for any group is less than 80% of the highest scoring group, and the difference is statistically significant. Though determining the adverse impact of a test seems simple, which is done by comparing the hiring rates of two groups, the actual nuts and bolts of the calculations can get complicated, and it is common that plaintiffs and defendants disagree on who is considered an applicant and who is considered a hire. For example, if a person applying for a job does not meet the minimum qualifications, he is not considered as an applicant in adverse impact calculations. Another example is if a plumber applies for a job as a brain surgeon, he clearly lacks the minimum qualifications for the job, which is a medical degree. There are three criteria for a minimum qualification. First, it must be needed to perform the job and not merely be a preference. Second, it must be formally identified and communicated prior to the start of the selection process. Third, it must be consistently applied. If a test results in adverse impact, the organization may have to court to defend itself. Thus, if the utility of the test is low, potential court costs will outweigh the minimal savings to the organization. Furthermore, a test with adverse impact will lead to poor public relations with minority communities, which could hurt recruitment or marketing efforts by the organization. Using the 80% rule to determine a test's fairness means that an organization must wait until it has used the test to select employees, at which time damage has already been done. A method of estimating adverse impact compares the average scores of minority applicants with those of the other applicants. This is most easily done by looking in the test manual to determine whether the minority applicants have significantly different test scores. If so, the test will probably have adverse impact, and an alternative test can be sought. In addition to adverse impact, an organization must also determine whether a test has single group validity, meaning that the test will significantly predict performance for one group and not others. For example, a test of reading ability might predict the performance of white clerks but not of African American clerks. To test for single group validity, separate correlations are computed between the test and the criterion for each group. If both correlations are significant, the test does not exhibit single group validity and it passes this fairness hurdle. If, however, only one of the correlations is significant, the test is considered fair for only that one group. Single group validity is very rare and is usually the result of small sample sizes and other methodological problems. Where it occurs, an organization has three choices. First, it can disregard single group validity because research indicates that it probably occurred by chance. Second is it can stop using the test. And third, it can use the test for only the one group and find another test to use for other groups. Regarding single group validity probably is the most appropriate choice, given that most industrial psychologists believe that single group validity occurs only by chance. There may be many cultural reasons as to why two groups score differently on a test, like their educational opportunities and their socioeconomic status. But finding a logical reason that the test would predict differently for two groups is difficult. If we do not believe that single group validity is a result of chance, we must adopt one of the other two options. As you can see, even though the third option is statistically correct, many legal and public relation problems may result. For example, let's use white Americans and African Americans as an example. So if an applicant asks, why did I get one test and my friend the other? We could respond that African Americans get one test and whites get another. But with such a response, it is provocative and ultimately may be counterproductive for an organization. With differential validity, a test is valid for two groups but more valid for one more than the other. Single group validity and differential validity are easily confused, but there is a big difference between the two. Remember, with single group validity, the test is valid only for one group. With differential validity, the test is valid for both groups, but it is more valid for one group more than the other. Like single group validity, differential validity is rare, but when it does occur, it is usually in occupations dominated by a single sex. Tests are more valid for the dominant sex and the tests overpredict minority performance. If differential group validity occurs, the organization has two choices. The first is not to use the test. Usually, however, this is not a good option. Finding a test that is valid is difficult. Throwing away a good test would be a shame. Second, the second option is to use the test with separate regression equations for each group. Because applicants do not realize that the test is scored differently, there are no public relation problems that could occur with the use of separate tests. If a test does not lead to adverse impact, does not have a single group validity, and does not have differential validity, it is considered to be fair. If the test fails to pass one of these three fairness hurdles, it may or may not be fair, depending on which model of fairness is followed. But to be used with complete confidence, a test must be valid, have utility, and be fair.
After valid and fair selection tests have been administered to a group of applicants, a final decision must be made. This is one of the skills that an HR should equip, which is a good decision-making skills. When we are presented with applicants with highest test scores, it seemed to give an easy decision, but this make more complicated as both number and variety of tests increase. If more than one criterion valid test is used, the scores must be combined. This statistical procedure is known as multiple regression. Linear approaches to hiring usually take one of four forms. These are unadjusted top-down selection, rules of three, passing scores, and the banding. Now we go over these approaches one by one. Top-down selection is then made by starting with the highest score and moving down until all openings have been filled. There is an advantage and disadvantage given in this slide. The example in the book highlights the four openings to hire top four scorers, and it happened that the top scorer were all males, and for affirmative action purposes, the company would want to hire two females, which the top-down selection would not allow us to do so. In a compensatory approach to top-down selection, an example is given. If the GPA is high enough, it would compensate for low GRE score. Now, to determine whether a score on one test can compensate for a score on another, that's when multiple regression is used, in which each test score is weighted according to how well it predicts the criterion. Another approach is the rule of three or the rule of five. This is a technique often used in a public sector. The HR can then choose any of the three based on the immediate needs of the employer. This ensures that the hired applicant is qualified. Third approach is passing scores. With this system, an organization determines the lowest score on a test that is associated with an acceptable performance on the job. An example would be that. But what is the lowest score on the SAT test that we can accept and still be confident that the student will be able to pass classes and eventually graduate? Notice the difference between top-down and passing scores. As you can see in their questions, passing score provide much flexibility. Why? Because when we go back to our example in the first approach, where with top-down results, we cannot yield female applicants, which the company also needs. The use of passing scores allow us to reach our affirmative action goals, which would not have been met with top-down selection. In other words, limitation sa top-down ni fill in ang passing score. If there is more than one test for which we have passing scores, a decision must be made regarding the use of these two approaches. This Venn diagram shows their similarity and differences. The multiple cut-off, if ma-fail sa test, they would not be considered for further employment. On the other hand, to reduce the cost associated with applicants failing one or more tests, multiple hurdle can be often used. For the last approach, a compromise between top-down hiring, which results in high levels of adverse impact, and passing score, decrease adverse impact yet reduces utility. There's this approach we called as banding, that take into consideration the degree of error associated with any test